2021 Clingendael State of the Union Conference. When I watched this year's State of the Union address of President of the European Commission Ursula von der Leyen, it struck me that she started and ended her speech by referring to the European soul. She quoted Robert Schuman, who said, "Europe needs a soul, an ideal, and the political will to serve this ideal." She started and ended her speech by referring to the European soul. In her concluding words, she pleaded to strengthen our European soul. Now, strengthening the soul of our union is a strong metaphor. It reminds me of the way in which romantic nationalists talked about the nation and the people of that nation. It refers to more than lofty goals. It denotes a belief in a shared heritage of ideals that are carried over from generation to generation, ideals that color and orient a way of life. Now, in political practice, ideals are carried over by political narratives rather than birth into a nation. These political stories give us an idea where we are coming from and a vision of where we want to go. Political narratives give a sense of purpose, a common future to a community. They can mobilize solidarity, define rights and obligations, and channel expectations. We thought that it would be timely to make European narratives the theme of this year's Clingendael State of the Union Conference. Towards European narratives in a global context. Strengthening the soul of Europe requires discussing and debating our European narratives. Narratives, in our view, are not just words, smart communication and spin. Narratives are about grand strategy, underlying political conflict and choices, and the exercise of power. There's a renewed urgency to discuss European narratives for at least 5 reasons. First, the great power context. You could say that for now, Fukuyama with his end of history has lost, and Huntington with his clash of civilizations has won the game of fortune telling and predicting the future. Economic globalization has not turned out to be the big equalizer by pushing all societies in the direction of market economy and democracy. Political systems, civilizations will continue to differ. The rise of China and the persistence of the Chinese model has been the sobering experience in that respect. The Chinese government is a strong narrator. The Chinese define what they aspire, and they assertively manifest themselves in Europe and other regions in the world. This forces Europeans to make more explicit what they stand for, what they want to protect and promote, what story Europe wants to tell. Second, the challenge of diversity within the European Union. Europe is not a nation. It consists of 27 member states with 27 different European narratives and perspectives. Integration and independence have brought us to the Europeanization of political questions that are highly politically salient aspects of the way of life in those 27 societies, like the way we integrate foreigners, if any, and the way we raise our children. How to accommodate diversity into an umbrella European narrative that represents these 27 societies, that generates alternatives to unification where intrusive harmonization in highly politically salient areas is felt unacceptable. This is an extra challenge for Europe compared to the other great powers that are nation states, or in the words of Tusk, disasters such as, for example, Brexit or Poland's potential exit from the EU very often happen not because someone has planned them, but because someone has been unable to plan a wise alternative to such a potential drama. Third, the polycrisis that Europe has gone through in the course of the last decade or so, the financial and euro crisis, the migration crisis, the Atlantic crisis, and the COVID-19 crisis. Each of these crises challenged Europe as a community. European integration has increased the interdependence of European states to such an extent by opting for €1, by abolishing the internal borders, that they are forced to react together to these crises, whereas they are not one nation and their institutions and political preferences still differ. We often speak about the European community, but in sociological terms, Europe is not, or not yet, a full-blown community. According to the American sociologist Talcott Parsons, a system like the European Union will only have the capacity to mobilize internal solidarity and to adjust to big challenges if it forms a community. And to speak of a community, according to him, a system needs a common economy, needs to be an economic community, common institutions that allow for common and binding decisions, political community. And these aspects of community have been realized by European integration. We have an internal common market and common institutions. But beyond that, to be a full-blown community requires societal community. In order to mobilize solidarity, a sense of togetherness is required, of cultural community, of common identity, values, and belonging. Now, contemporary Europe is a halfway house, being an economic and political community, whereas not or not yet being a strong social and cultural community. And each of the polycrises, in fact, challenged Europe as a social and cultural community. Which foreigners will we protect together in our cultural community if we no longer have internal borders in our economic community? And which demands as regards cultural homogeneity and the rule of law are appropriate if steps in the direction of social community are made with, for instance, Next-Gen EU? Von der Leyen said in her speech, "I believe that is when you are tested that your spirit, your soul truly shines through." Discussing our political narratives also means discussing whether we can and want to be a social and cultural community and what we define to be of value, what the rights and obligations in our community are and will be. Fourth, we need democratic debates about that common future and our narratives. Economic integration does not automatically produce social and cultural community. Integration by stealth, the idea that integration continues step by step until there's no turning back, is undemocratic and unproductive. We've seen strong counter-EU narratives developing. This is a fourth and pressing reason to discuss our European narratives. And fifth, our concluding reason is that paradigm shifts are taking place. European narrative building should be self-critical, based on learning from policy failures and based on science. Evaluation as a source of knowledge. In dealing with the multiple crises, we see several strategic paradigm shifts underway. To name a couple of the most important ones, the state is brought back in. Second, the turn to a geopolitical role for Europe. And third, the necessity of new alliances in Europe. So many urgent reasons to discuss European narratives in the 3 days to come. I'm delighted that two wise and inspirational ministers, two friends of Clingendael, with a long-standing career in European integration, will open our discussions on European narratives. A warm welcome to Minister Clement Beaune and Minister Tom de Bruijn. Thank you very much for joining us. And happy to pass the floor to my colleague Rem Korteweg, who will moderate the keynote speeches. I wish you a very fruitful conference.
Thank you very much, Monica. And it's a great pleasure to host this opening panel, these two keynote speeches. And it's just worth reminding everyone who's joined us online that over the next 3 days, we will have 9 panels looking at narratives from different perspectives. Minister Beaune, Clement Beaune, it is a great pleasure to welcome you to the Clingendael Institute once again, after you joined us a couple of years ago, albeit this time, unfortunately, beamed in from Paris rather than live here in The Hague. Now, as you will have heard, the focus of this year's conference is on European narratives, the diversity of narratives within and about Europe, but also the importance of developing a common European story, and dare I say it, a common European vision. Now, recently, a number of events have transpired that have brought renewed attention to the concept of European sovereignty. The withdrawal from Afghanistan, a submarine deal between the United States and Australia, but also growing concerns about technology dependencies with the outside world, and in fact, reflecting on Sunday's election results in Germany, Olaf Scholz also mentioned the need to build a strong and sovereign Europe. And I ask, is this the basis for a new narrative about Europe, sovereignty? And in many respects, Mr. Minister, you are the best person to ask this question at this time, because we are facing the upcoming conference on the future of Europe, the upcoming French presidency, and dare I say, the upcoming French presidential elections. Monsieur le Ministre, Mr. Beaune, I offer you the floor, and please tell us, what is the message about Europe, the story about Europe that you bring to us this morning?
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me.
Cornet.
And thank you very much for your invitation. And I'm sorry I couldn't.
What is the message about Europe, the story about Europe that you bring to us this morning?
Can you hear me? Thank you very much. Yes. You can hear me? Because I have an echo when I speak. Sorry. Can you hear me? Well, I will try again. Sorry. Thank you again for your invitation, for this opportunity to discuss with you this morning. And I'm very happy to have this possibility, and a bit sad not to be live with you in The Hague this morning, but I will try to convey the messages though. Thank you also for this question about the narratives and the messages that we should convey, because one of the probably key weaknesses of the EU as a political project now is to lack these narratives, that a lot of powers, competitors, rivals, particular authoritative powers which are surrounding us, are much more able than us to convey. Although we should be very proud of a lot of results and achievements in this project, sometimes we are still a bit shy in insisting on these successes, in conveying these messages internally and externally. My thinking about this is that the big challenge for Europe is to do a kind of U-turn in terms of focus. If we try to very briefly look backwards and understand what our European project as a political project has been about, we know and we see that it has been an inward-looking project for 6 decades, I would say. And this is not a problem, this is a success. But this is a new step that we need to open now. Why is it an inward-looking project? Because basically the EU project, or the European Communities project at the very beginning, soon after the Second World War, was about reconciling European enemies. Of course, France and Germany, in this first club of the 6 founding member states, it was about bringing us together in a period of Cold War, in the aftermath of the Second World War, to create freedom, to root our liberties and prosperities in a political project, to bring cooperation where we had division before and destruction before. And this is the DNA of the political project, which was built after 1950. It's a big success. I don't think that peace was brought, of course, only by the European construction, but it was clearly rooted in our continent through the European cooperation. But all and everything we have succeeded to do was about this reconciliation, this cooperation between us. We created a common market. It became a single market. We have deepened it through the economic and monetary union. We have developed one single foreign policy at the beginning, which was a trade policy, which was the extension of this domestic or internal cooperation abroad in a peaceful manner and in an open manner. So it was a project about openness and about cooperation between European member states. We should not forget this, again, because it has worked and we should be very proud. I think the founding fathers would be proud of what we have succeeded to do and to extend. We also have, of course, enlarged our cooperation to a lot of member states and recently to the eastern part of Europe, 10 years only after the fall of the USSR. So all this is very successful, but all the challenges we have now are outward looking. When we look at the main concerns or expectations of European citizens, I think it's quite shared. We have, of course, political differences or nuances, but the expectations, the main expectations of our European citizens are shared widely. They are all about external challenges or challenges which have mainly an external dimension. Migration, climate change, which of course is a European scale issue, but a global issue. How we deal with our new trade policy in a moment of rivalry, or tension, competition, in particular with China, which has come as a new player, which was de facto not existing on the global stage 6 decades ago. Security and defense with a new US concept, US approach, which is not recent, but which has started after the end of the Cold War, and which is very visible now. It's a focus which is not as much on Europe and much more on the Pacific or Indo-Pacific region, as we have seen recently. I could go back to this. But all the challenges we have to face are mainly external. And we have still very little space, very few tools in the European toolbox, to deal with these elements and these dimensions. Our foreign security policy is not fully new, but it is just the beginning of the story. Our trade policy is still, I would say, not something too French, but still a bit naive, because it's just about opening markets. And I think we do not use it enough as a strategic tool to promote our standards and to protect not our markets, but our levels of standards regarding climate, regarding social standards, regarding tax issues, for instance. In this respect, France and the Netherlands have worked very fruitfully together recently on the greening of our trade policy and the migration issue, to mention a challenge which remains or is again an important challenge after the Afghan crisis, or could be one. We have still very few elements of an EU policy. So just to say that it's not a surprise that it's so difficult to move forward on defense and migration, to some extent on climate policy, on trade reforms and so on, because our DNA was not this one. It was this inward-looking cooperation. Linked to this, there is this notion of, or this concept of power or sovereignty. I know that this idea of European sovereignty, which President Macron has been using a lot since 2016-2017, is sometimes questioned across the EU, even though I think it has spread quite successfully to some extent. But this is also the consequence of this new paradigm or this new concept. If we are outward looking, if we want Europe to be able to promote or to defend, depending on the moment and the issue, its values and its interests in the world, we have to combine cooperation that we should not lose. This was the success of the inward-looking project, and power. And if we look, I'm not an expert of history, but if we look at the history very briefly of our continent over at least the last 2 centuries, we have never combined power and cooperation. We have had power, obviously, especially in the 19th century. We have dominated the world, sometimes in a very aggressive manner, but that was a fact. Europe was the dominant element of international relations. We were so powerful that we could allow to fight against each other. That led, unfortunately, to civil wars and world wars, which were the same, the two conflicts we saw in the 20th century or the first half of the 20th century. And after that, which has led to what I describe as the first steps of the political project in Europe, we have realized that power, or the focus on power, the excess of power, has led to not only non-cooperation, but war and destruction. And we have kind of vaccinated ourselves, if I can use this word in the current context, but I think it's true. We have vaccinated ourselves against power. So we have said, okay, power is not for us. Europeans cannot use it in a peaceful manner. Either they dominate the world aggressively or they kill each other. So let's reconcile each other. This has worked. Let's transfer the elements of power, defense, security to our protection, the US, NATO, or to some extent leave it in the member states, but not at the European communities or EU level for sure. And now we have, because of this external dimension, to preserve this extraordinary cooperation we have built, and probably the longest period of peace in centuries on our continent, to keep it as a treasure, I would say, and to add to this cooperation spirit power in the world on the global stage, including finding the right distance, not destroying the relation, not damaging the relation, but trying to find the right distance, not too close, not too far, with our US protector and US ally. This is basically the challenge we have to face. And with power comes also narrative. There's no power with the absence of a narrative. There's no power who helps, saves, or sometimes dominates a neighbor, a partner, a rival, without saying a story about it. You can take very basic stories, actually. When China has been sending masks to us, selling masks to us at the beginning of the COVID crisis, but also giving some of them to, for instance, Balkan countries, I was very struck because this was a direct example. You had, for instance, in Serbia, but it could happen everywhere in the Balkan region, you had the president of Serbia at the airport saying, China has saved us, thank you for the masks. We have sent, as EU, much more medical equipment to Serbia or to other countries, I'm just taking this concrete example, than China. No one has ever said, thanks to the EU, our health situation has improved, thanks to the EU, our investments are better, and so on. Because we are providing a foreign policy to some extent, pursuing a foreign policy, but in such a discreet manner, in such a shy manner, that no one is aware of it. And sometimes ourselves are not aware that we have already some elements of international policy, of course, development aid, medical support, whatever. We are, as EU, or EU member states and the European institutions taken together, the first provider now of medical support, vaccine doses in Africa, for instance. I hope the US will be more active than us, fine. But at this moment, and so far, it's been the EU or EU member states. Who knows about it? Who says it? So we are never able to put our flag somewhere. It's true, actually, internally sometimes. I'm always very struck when I visit some recovery projects or economic projects or infrastructure projects in France, that the European flag is so small and the flag of the region or the city is that big. Because we have a problem recognizing that Europe is a political project and that Europe is doing things, just simply that. Concrete things, concrete support, international policy, even more difficult. So this is what we should bring, I think, in the European DNA, in the European software. I think this has to be more optimistic and more positive, because I think this has changed already very rapidly over the last 4 or 5 years, I would say, under the pressure of shocks, external shocks sometimes, Mr. Trump in the US, Brexit, of course. Also, I hope some energy brought by governments and countries, including France, including President Macron. I think this has changed. And as French politician or French citizen, more simply, I would say, we also have to recognize, if we want to be more efficient in this extension of the sovereignty concept, power concept in the EU, we have to recognize this progress. If we go to Berlin as a French official, for instance, or to The Hague and say, guys, we are not quick enough, we are not moving forward enough, European defense is nowhere, and so on. If we do say that, if we behave this way, we will kill any further step forward. Why? Because it's very difficult to change the software and to change DNA. I take the example of Germany, because of course it's the player in Europe with which we work most to adjust this. We have to recognize as French that in Germany, there has been a huge change regarding this defense thinking. They have, the German government has sent 1,000 soldiers in Mali, in Sahel. It's not a minor thing. They have engaged with us in some bilateral industrial defense projects. This is not a minor thing. We have to recognize. If we don't start by recognizing the progress, we will not make further progress. I was recently in the Baltic region, in Estonia, in Lithuania, for instance. Estonia has been fighting with us in Sahel for a few years now. If we don't start by saying this, thank you guys for this. This was a huge effort. This was something totally immensely difficult to set up, because when you're in Tallinn, it's difficult to imagine that what happens in Sahel has an impact on your own security, and they have done so. We have to recognize it if we want to create trust, confidence, and move forward. Because, of course, all these external elements I was mentioning, whether it's migration, whether it's defense, or other topics, are historically extremely sensitive and built in the very deep political DNA of each of our member state or nation states. So it's normal. It takes time to change. It's normal. But I think the European Union is on the right path. Sometimes we're on the right path, advancing too slowly. That's sometimes our problem, or not being proud enough or adamant enough about what we are doing. This is a narrative issue. But I think we should move in this direction. And as a French official being soon in charge of some elements of the French EU Council presidency, I'm obsessed in a way with this, that we recognize what we are doing together before moving forward. Just to finish on a few elements to open the discussion that's been already too long, on the French presidency of the EU Council that will start in January, in less than 100 days now, which puts a lot of pressure on us. These elements will be central. And I just want to mention 3 items or 3 boxes that we want to open or to speed up on during the presidency. Climate discussions, of course, which is at the crossroads of external and internal issues. And on this, we are working very well with the Netherlands, including on the external dimension, like this carbon border adjustment mechanism, for instance. The social agenda, which I think is very important also to have a kind of support in our population on the European model, which has been very strong, very powerful during the crisis, but there are some elements which need to be modernized, adjusted. The social right for platform workers, digital platform workers, for instance. And third element, again, at the crossroads of the internal and external dimensions, the digital regulation. We have, I think, good text on the table called DSA, DMA. I'm not going into too many details, but you know them, which we are discussing on. We are not yet there. But if we could finalize at least one of these 2 important texts during the French EU presidency, that would be also a good achievement in this direction. So I just wanted to mention these elements. Sorry, I've been a bit long, and sorry for the initial connection issue, but I hope this was clear enough. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. Those were very insightful comments. I note that you called for a software upgrade of the European Union. And software upgrades tend to be easier than DNA upgrades. So perhaps in that respect, this development of this common narrative may go quicker than you than you might assume. I'm also very intrigued by your comments regarding that Europe primarily faces external challenges, whether trade, migration, climate change. And in that respect, I think it's excellent that we have as our second keynote speaker the Dutch Minister for International Trade and Development Cooperation. I'm very pleased to welcome Minister Tom de Bruijn to the Clingendael Institute. Minister de Bruijn, you are, of course, quite familiar with the Institute, and it is an honor to welcome you back in your capacity as minister. Now, reflecting on Minister Beaune's comments, we're very much looking forward to your assessment about the Dutch contribution to this European narrative, perhaps also touching on this deeply contested issue of strategic autonomy, how that should take place, and perhaps also address Minister Beaune's notion that there is no power without a narrative. Is this something that you can work with? Mr. Minister, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rem. Thank you very much, Monica. It's a great pleasure for me to be back at Clingendael. The weather is beautiful. And also a great pleasure to meet Clement Beaune. I hope to see you in Paris somewhere in the coming weeks. And I wish you every success with the upcoming French presidency of the Council of the European Union. Well, today's conference is about narratives, and I would like to share some thoughts with you on a very important topic about open strategic autonomy. And it is, you could say, the title of a narrative, but we do not always know the content of the story. So let me try to tell you what open strategic autonomy means for me in my capacity as Minister for International Trade. And therefore it is probably a little bit less philosophical, but more down to earth as trade is. Open strategic autonomy for me is, in short, the EU's ability to safeguard its values and interests. And that in a balance between an open economy on the one hand and strategic autonomy on the other. And by an open economy, I do not mean a free for all. On the contrary, we have an interest in a predictable and rules-based international trading system. However, a rules-based order is not what we meant by it, say, 25 years ago, or in the good old days of the GATT. In those days, international trade was more or less a sort of autonomous system. Its purpose was twofold: a set of rules with a dispute settlement mechanism on the one hand, and on the other, successive rounds of trade liberalization. It was about market access by lowering tariffs and non-tariff barriers in order to foster economic growth. And of course, there were special rules for developing countries. All these rules are still crucial, but at the same time, things are changing, or rather, we are in a transition. International trade and investment is not anymore a secluded biotope. Trade has a direct relation with sustainable development and, for example, climate change. Even more so, I would say, trade agreements are becoming instruments to enhance sustainable development, including issues like decent work, fight against child labor, the protection of the environment, and last but not least, the mitigation of climate change. This leads to tensions between the old and the new paradigm. As we have seen, for example, in the controversies over trade agreements like CETA with Canada or Mercosur with a number of Latin American countries. But ultimately, I see no contradiction. If we want to enhance international trade in order to create welfare, we have to make sure that trade agreements foster sustainable development and help to fight climate change. And vice versa. In pursuing these objectives, trade agreements are a support, not an impediment. This has nothing to do, I would like to stress, with protectionism, but with creating a better world. France and the Netherlands are working closely together on this issue. Recently, we have presented a common paper on it to the European Commission, in which, for example, we suggest that tariff reductions could be linked to the implementation of sustainable development commitments. Another example where trade policy will help the fight against climate change is the proposal within the framework of Fit for 55, the big framework on the big package on climate change, is the proposal on CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanism. In more normal terms, a sort of tariff on the CO2 component of imported products. This measure will incentivize third countries to adopt measures to reduce CO2 emissions. And it is my firm wish that this modernization of trade policy by the EU will also be reflected in the upcoming work of the WTO, the World Trade Organization. France and the Netherlands will plead for that at the upcoming ministerial meeting of the WTO in Geneva. And this could reinvigorate the multilateral trading system, still so fundamental for us, and also to foster a level playing field with regard particularly to countries that support their industry by mass state capital. And that brings me to the other component of the balance to strategic autonomy. What do I understand by it? Certainly not a decoupling from trading partners we increasingly see as a systemic rival. This is undesirable and, by the way, impossible. It would come at great cost. But like Minister Beaune said, we should not be naive either. We have to make a solid analysis where we are vulnerable in the international supply lines of important products. The COVID pandemic in that sense has taught us a lesson. Once we have made such an analysis, we will have to act upon it. And I'm happy that the Vice President of the European Commission, my friend Maroš Šefčovič, has recently in his published Strategic Foresight report touched upon this issue. But once we have made all these analyses, we will have to act upon it. We will have to implement it. And that will not be easy and might put us sometimes in front of very difficult dilemmas. Making strategic choices may come at a short-term economic cost, but we have to come to grips with the asymmetric situation where we have been for a long time, where we consider something as essentially a commercial activity, but our systemic rivals see it as purely geopolitical. But there are also opportunities. Analyzing vulnerabilities caused by unwanted dependencies can also lead to positive action. For example, President Ursula von der Leyen, in her State of the Union speech, has proposed a European Chips Act. The Netherlands wholeheartedly supports this idea because the global chip shortage has caused widespread disturbances in several industries. The EU is vulnerable because its worldwide market share in semiconductors is less than 10%. And it is in our strategic interest that Europe in this field should become rather a giant. The Netherlands is home to some of the most advanced manufacturers in the semiconductor industry. And together with France, once again, we can provide valuable input to the upcoming European Commission's proposals on a Chips Act. And to conclude, more broadly speaking, EU industries and value chains should become more resilient, both economically and geopolitically. An open trading system must go hand in hand with strategic autonomy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. And thank you very much for sharing your thoughts on open strategic autonomy, particularly from a trade perspective. Now, if I may use this opportunity to ask you one follow-up question. We are here together with two ministers, one from the Netherlands, one from France. If you read newspaper reports, there sometimes tends to be a contradiction between Dutch and French perspectives on the European Union. You've highlighted a key non-paper that was written by France and the Netherlands in terms of pushing the agenda forward on trade and sustainability. There's also a Franco-Dutch initiative on dealing with the platform economy. Could you perhaps look in your crystal ball and assess where you see the Netherlands and France joining forces to move the agenda forward that you described regarding open strategic autonomy, but also the notions that Minister Beaune put on the table regarding developing a common narrative where power meets cooperation?
Well, that's quite a question. But I would say that within the new relationships in the European Union after the departure of the United Kingdom, there is a new setting within the European Union. And of course, Germany has always been a very important partner for the Netherlands, our main trading partner also, some 200 billion euro a year in trade. But in this new situation, France also has become a very important partner to us. And the changing geopolitical setting of the outside world, France and the Netherlands have come together because we share a common interest of a strong European Union. And as I explained in my lecture, traditionally, France and the Netherlands were at the opposite sides on trade policy. We were more the liberal ones and the French were more the protectionist ones. At least that was the vision of public opinion. But now we are coming together. And that's why we wrote this paper together. So I think there are plenty of opportunities for cooperation between France and the Netherlands. And actually, President Macron is meeting quite often with our Prime Minister, Mark Rutte. So I have full confidence that in the future there will be plenty of opportunities. May I mention one other subject which I didn't mention in my speech, and that's the upcoming discussion about due diligence for European companies when we speak about labor standards, the environment, etc. Very soon, I hope the Commission will come up with a concrete proposal on this. The French, unlike the Netherlands, already have national legislation in this field. And therefore, I think also on this topic, France and the Netherlands can play a very important incentivizing role within the European Union.
Thank you very much for that. And I don't know whether we can still ask Minister Beaune a question, if he can be brought back on the video, that would be fantastic. Minister Beaune, can you hear us?
I do. I can.
Very good. Would you like to reflect a little bit on this, on the Dutch-French bilateral relationship in this context of developing a narrative about Europe and the strategic autonomy? Again, I feel inspired by your comment about the necessity for a software upgrade, and it seems, at least on trade, that France and the Netherlands have introduced the right patches to their software. But where do you see that relationship heading, Minister?
Well, I think our bilateral relationship between the Netherlands and France is a very good example of these recent evolutions. It is, as the Minister said, a relation which has improved over the last 4 years, I would say. It was already, of course, a good relation from the very beginning of the European communities. We've been working together. But if I take the French approach, and if I can reflect on what I think is a Dutch perspective from what I see, on the French side, we have realized, after Brexit in particular, but as we wanted to develop a new European positive and constructive leadership, that we could not be exclusively working with Germany. It's never been the case, but what President Macron has insisted on in terms of methods from the very beginning is that we should work more deeply with Germany, meaning that we should work on substance, not just say we are friends, we've been allies, we've been working together for 60 years, but having substance in our bilateral relation, sometimes tensions, what we have seen with the recovery plan, for instance, and extends the deep cooperations with other partners in Europe. And Netherlands is a very good example of this because we've known each other as political partners for nearly 70 years now, but I think we were not working enough together in substance. Trade is a good example, and we were not trying to reconcile our approaches, thinking probably a bit easily that we were not on the same page. That basically the cliche was that the Netherlands was totally a free trade, single market oriented and so on, and France was protectionist, not willing to work with the US and very tough on Brexit. And I mean, there is always truth in that, but I think the common ground was bigger than we expected. And just to take a concrete illustration of this, I think the number of bilateral visits between, as you said, between Prime Minister Rutte and President Macron has been now reaching 12, I think, in 4.5 years. Which is, I think, unheard of in the bilateral relations. It's not only about meetings, but it really says something about the closeness we have developed. And when you look at the substance, we have moved towards each other. I think one of the reasons why the Netherlands also wanted to engage more with France was that with Brexit, the idea to readjust the alliances and the work in Europe was there, which allowed this convergence. But in substance, we have seen, for instance, in France that we were not as reluctant to the liberal agenda, I would say, of the free trade agenda of Europe. Of course, we need a single market. We have realized how important it was through Brexit. Of course, we need a trade policy, we need trade agreements. On the other side, to take this example that the Minister knows very well, the Netherlands has recognized that having rules was not about being protectionists, but about building a level playing field, defending some very important European values and interests, climate being one of them. And that's in the end why, to take just this important and telling example, we met each other on this trade issue. We are both defending the carbon border adjustment mechanism because we know it's good for climate, we know it's not protectionist, we know it's about level playing fields, and we met on this instrument, on this issue, as we have done on other issues like posted work reform and so on. So I think this intellectual and conceptual work of working together is a very good illustration of this software update to bounce back on this that we mentioned.
Thank you very much for that. And we will continue to elaborate on some of the ideas and insights both of you have brought to the table in the panels to come. I'm very much aware of both your busy agendas, and I'd like to thank you very much, particularly also Minister Beaune, for taking time from his schedule in Paris to join us virtually. I look forward to the moment when you can travel to the Clingendael Institute again. The door is always open. And of course, Minister de Bruijn, it's fantastic to see you here. Thank you very much for taking your time. And we are going to take a quick break now. And at 11:30, we're going to continue with our first proper panel on European narratives of the member states, unity in diversity. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rem, and I wish you a very good conference.